Welcome to the Rocket PD podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of Rocket PD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
When I think about why I became a teacher, it's because I wanted to develop relationships with young people and help them grow. It's not because I wanted to stand at the front of the room and exercise power over them and have them be quiet and listen to me.
Robert Barnett is the co-founder of the Modern Classrooms Project and author of the book Meeting Every Learner's Needs, Redesigning Instruction so all students can succeed. On this episode of the Rocket PD podcast, I asked Robert about his journey as a classroom teacher, the challenges of one-size-fits-all instruction, and how the community he's building through MCP is changing the status quo.
But that's how it felt often as a teacher, like I had to stand up at my board and control the classroom. I didn't like that. It was frustrating, and I didn't feel like I was achieving what I wanted to achieve.
We talk about ways that simple tools like video, self-paced lessons, and mastery checks can be used to individualize learning.
I think when I changed that and I was able to sit down with my students during class, it was fun. It's the best word I can use to describe it. Like I was getting to know the young people. I was watching them not know how to do something, watch a video, ask me questions, work with their classmates, and then learn how to do it. And I knew they were really learning it because I was giving them these mastery checks.
And we ask and just maybe answer the question, is it possible to meet every learner's needs? Stick around to find out. Robert, great to have you. I know we're talking a little bit today about student instruction and specifically about creating instruction that can engage all students. I know, just coming out of the pandemic and just generally with the educators that we've been talking to, frontline educators, particularly teachers, are really struggling to really engage all of their students. I think what they're finding more so even than in the past is that students are at different levels of engagement, particularly coming out of COVID. There are more gaps. How do we get to a place in our classrooms where we can start engaging students and educating all of them in the context of the situation that they're in and the place that they're at? And I know this has been a big area of focus for you and for the Modern Classrooms Project. So I thought before we kind of dive into the topic, I'd love to hear a little bit about the work that Modern Classrooms is doing and some of the stuff that you guys have learned over the course of the last several years, and in particular, really the last year, as we've started to see some of this data come out and some of these frustrations from teachers really begin to pile up in the classroom.
Sure, I'd be happy to speak to that. And thanks for having me here to discuss something I really care about, which is classroom instruction and how teachers can best meet students' needs. You're absolutely right to flag that this is a challenge that's really important post-pandemic. I think we've seen that the pandemic has caused gaps between learners and what they know to widen. And so things now are in some ways harder than they've ever been for teachers and for students. But the challenges that teachers and students face in their classrooms, I think, predate COVID and in fact are fundamental to teaching. And that challenge is when you have a bunch of different students in a class, could be 5 students or could be 40 students, they inevitably need different things. On any given day, some students are going to be ready for a challenge because they already understand the lesson. Some students are going to struggle to understand that lesson because they have gaps in their learning. And some are going to be absent. They're going to miss class. They might miss out altogether. And so I think these gaps are wider after the pandemic, but they existed before the pandemic as well. I think that's a good opportunity for me to share a little bit about myself and my story. I was a teacher in DC public schools well before the pandemic. I encountered this exact challenge in my own classes. I remember I had a first period pre-calculus class, and there were about 20 students on the roster. And sometimes at the bell to start class, there would be 5 students in the room. Students would sort of trickle in. Students would miss class for several days at a time. Some were advanced, ahead of grade level, some were on grade level, some were many years below grade level. And I had to figure out, how do I actually meet these learners' needs? How do I teach them all effectively? What I realized is that standing in front of the room at my board explaining something to the students who happened to be there wasn't going to cut it. Some students were bored, some students were lost, some weren't there at all. It wasn't going to be good enough, and it was frustrating for me. I really stood there and I wanted to quit most days. So I had to try something new. What I did is that I took the direct instruction I was providing, in other words, what I was offering at the board, and I just recorded it on video. Very simple videos, nothing fancy. I would literally start a video call with myself, hit record, explain something. Now I had a video to share with my students. Once I could share that video with my students, they could watch it at their own paces. They could pause, rewatch, ask me questions. And I could spend my time in class working closely with each of my students. I loved that. I wasn't at the board yelling at them, controlling their behavior. I was sitting down with them, answering their questions, helping them learn, getting to know them in the process. And then the best part was I could make sure that students actually understood lesson 1 before they started lesson 2. Knowledge builds on itself, right? So that's so important that we make sure students have a foundation of mastery from which to build on. This method of teaching was really successful for me. I had a colleague downstairs named Kareem Farah. He was struggling too. He visited my classroom, liked what he saw. The very next day, he started teaching this way too. He made videos. He was sitting down with his students. He was requiring mastery. And we learned a lot from one another as we were each teaching and meeting our students' needs in this way. We ended up deciding what we're doing is worth sharing. We want to share it with our colleagues. Let's start a nonprofit and let's explain to other teachers how they can do this. So we founded the Modern Classrooms Project. We help any teacher in any school anywhere in the world, no matter what grade or subject they teach, apply this same method in their own classroom. Digitize direct instruction using videos, let students work at their own paces, spend high quality time in class working closely with students, and make sure students achieve mastery before they move on. And today we've reached about 80,000 educators all over the world. We are learning from them. We're trying to grow one teacher in classroom at a time, a movement towards learning experiences that address this fundamental challenge of teaching, right? That really do meet every learner's needs.
That's really cool. So you've built this community. It's kind of an experience that you had and your colleagues had, and you were able to kind of build this community out based on that. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're reaching the different educators, or how other educators are hearing about this and coming in to this community to learn from you and what you're building?
Absolutely. I mean, what we try to offer is a general framework filled with a lot of actionable sort of classroom tested practices that any teacher can use. So we're not just looking for teachers in public schools or private schools or urban or rural or math or science. We have a library of materials that we make available for free, as we're a nonprofit, to any teacher who's interested in learning our model. You can go to modernclassrooms.org and you can see all of our approach just kind of laid out there for you for free with resources you can use to start teaching this way. And so most of our growth has been really organic. Teachers thinking, well, look, one lesson at a time at the teacher's pace isn't working for my students. I need something new. And they find us, and a lot of teachers are finding this approach really helps me. I feel more satisfied. My learners feel more confident. We're all enjoying class more, and we're learning more too. So really how the modern classroom's approach and practices spread is word of mouth, teacher to teacher. It works. It worked for me. It worked for my co-founder, Kareem. When other teachers hear about it, if they think it will work in their classrooms, it will. So of course, I'm on this podcast. We're at conferences, we're writing articles, we're trying to spread the word, but our growth really has been driven by teachers who realize there's a better way and see that our approach is a way to help all their students succeed.
Now, you mentioned a little bit, the three sort of pillars, right? The blended approach, and I want to talk about that in a second. This idea that things are self-paced, and then, of course, the mastery piece of this. And I've obviously been on your website. I look a little bit. Have looked a little bit at some of the work that you all do. There's also a piece of this around apprenticeship, right? And I wanted to know if you could press on that a little bit, the apprenticeship and how that works. The reason I ask is because oftentimes when I'm talking to teachers, they get really excited about an approach or an idea, but then they say, I need help figuring out how to implement this in my classroom. And, that's great, but they like to hear it oftentimes, what I've found, from the folks who have been there, done that, and wear similar shoes to the shoes that they're wearing every day. So can you tell me a little bit about apprenticeship and how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So I developed this approach in my classroom as a teacher. This solved everyday problems for me. It solved problems for Kareem and our colleagues too. So our whole model is really built on that, like our experience as teachers, and the tools we recommend teachers use are the exact same tools that we ourselves used in our classroom. So this is backed by research and theory, but it's really a practical approach. In
I
terms of
love that. Yeah, it's like it just keeps coming back. And the more conversations I have with educators about different approaches, different frameworks, will always say inevitably, right? Can you find me another person who is doing this that I can model this work after? Because there are different nuances to things, obviously, that happen in your own classroom that you need to be prepared for. But I think understanding how others have implemented things in the past help you prepare for those things. So that's a really cool idea and approach. And I love the idea of building a community of teachers who together can share information and help each other out, which I think at the end of the day really is, what this idea is all about. Before we go further, I like this idea of blended instruction. Of course, we know a little bit about that. We've talked about it on this podcast. But I think that the secret sauce here might not just be the blended piece, but the way that you bring these other pieces together. So I thought we could talk a little bit about blended instruction is a proven practice, right, in the classroom. A lot of folks use that. But your model says, let's take a blended approach and then let's bring these other things into it to create perhaps a framework that teachers can model in their classrooms. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between, just blended instruction and then the different pieces that you are bringing into it to make it scalable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, blended instruction means so many different things to so many different people. So I think it's probably easiest for me just to explain in detail how our model really works. The first thing to say is that technology in our model, it replaces a very narrow and specific part of the lesson, which is the teacher's direct instruction. So if you're a teacher and you need to explain something to your students, you can do that from the front of the room. It's probably going to take a long time because you'll have to manage behavior and students will need repeating or you'll be interrupted. We say just do that on a video instead. Now you've cloned yourself and now you're free to work closely with students during class. So that's the blending part, is just taking your direct instruction, putting it on video. From there, students work at their own paces through the material. I think this does distinguish the modern classroom approach from other approaches like a flipped classroom. What I know as a teacher and also as a parent is that, and as a learner myself, is that students learn at different paces, right? They need different amounts of time to understand certain content. And so what we say is for advanced students, if they can learn something really fast and they're ready for a challenge, great. They shouldn't spend more time than they need learning that skill or standard. If a student needs 2 days to really understand something, they should have those 2 days, because if we just rush them along, we're really not doing good for their knowledge or their self-esteem, quite honestly. And if a student is absent on Monday, they shouldn't come back and start on Tuesday's lesson. They should start with Monday's lesson. And so once you have your videos, students can move through them at their own pace. and the teacher can require mastery. So what I mean by that is that at the end of each self-paced lesson, a student takes something called a mastery check. It's usually a very short assessment, 1 or 2 questions. And if a student shows they understand, great, they move to the next lesson. If not, you say, hang on a sec, don't move on to the next lesson. Let's revise. Let me explain your misconception to you. Take another chance. And only once you understand it can you move on. I think that prevents learning gaps from forming. And that also gives students self-confidence like, look, I can learn this. And so I think those are the, digital instruction, self-paced learning, and mastery checks are really what define our approach. I want to also just get back to what you said about apprenticeship. We call it mentorship. We have something called a mentorship program, where if you are an elementary teacher, we will pair you with someone who's using our model in an elementary classroom, and you'll work together to figure out, okay, how do I make a video that keeps elementary students engaged? What's best for a mastery check? How long should I let my students self-pace before we do a reset? Because I agree with you completely. It's great to have practices and principles. It's good to have examples, and we provide a lot of examples for free. And then for teachers who do want more, we offer this mentorship program where it's one-to-one, an expert versus someone learning it, to really apply the approach in your own classroom, because ultimately every teacher in every classroom is unique. You need to make this approach work best for you and your students.
I love the comment about sort of the uniqueness and the nuances of individual classrooms. I mean, certainly that plays out everywhere that we go. Let me ask you this: new teachers, veteran teachers, who are you seeing in the community? Who are you seeing this model work best for? Does it work best for new, veteran, some combination of the two? Because I know we have a lot of new teachers coming into the space. I think there's also, at least from what we've heard, visiting classrooms in the last year, a lot of veteran teachers who are saying, "Man, I wish I had something new and different that I could do just to get myself, as much as my students, excited about being back in the classroom." So can you tell me about that mix?
Absolutely. I mean, what I would say here is if you think this will work for you, it will. And if you think it won't, it won't. So if this doesn't sound good to you, don't do it, right? You're a teacher. I trust your judgment. But if you do think this is going to work for you, I think it will work well. And we've seen new teachers use it. We often see 20-year veterans who say, wow, like I wish I had this at the start of my career. So we've seen a full spectrum of teachers use this approach and use it successfully. One thing I will say is that it does help to really understand your content well before you start digitizing it for videos and before you start giving mastery checks. So I think teachers often feel like, if they're teaching a new course, it can be a little difficult to do this well. Once they have the subject area knowledge under their belts, this becomes effective, and it makes your life way easier, by the way, because once you have a video, you don't have to repeat yourself 100 times. You have the video. Once you can sit down one-on-one with students in class, you don't need to stay after school, right? You're checking in with students in class. So it does make your life easier. But I think if you're a teacher listening to this, I would say, make sure you really understand your content first. Make sure you're comfortable teaching it. Then this approach will take you to the next level. If you're trying to do a million things at once, it's going to be difficult to do it well.
Yeah, for sure. And then speaking of that, right, this notion of whenever you try to do something new or different, right, there's a little bit of a learning curve, whether you're a student or you're a teacher. And so, one of the things you mentioned was sort of digitizing your lessons. If I'm new to this as a teacher, how do I think about that? Is that something that's easy for me to do? Do you guys offer help with what that looks like or should look like? What's the best way to think about, okay, I'm leaning in. I like this idea of blended instruction. I like this idea of individualizing, self-pacing, and I like this idea of, mastery, right? These three things sit really well with me as an educator and what I'm trying to achieve. But how do I get started, right? I like the idea. How do I get started?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it can definitely feel intimidating and like a lot of work to hear this all explained for the first time. And digitizing your direct instruction, I think consistently, that's a piece that people feel intimidated by. They think it's going to be really hard to create a great video for my students. And to that, I say, don't worry about creating a great video your first time around, right? First of all, if you don't know how to create a video, if you can get on a video call, you can create a video, right? You start a Zoom call with yourself, you hit record, you explain something, you have a video. If you don't want to make videos, you can also find other people's videos online, right? There's a ton of good videos out there explaining content. I always found my students liked my videos. I could explain it the way I wanted and they felt a connection to me. But a lot of modern classroom educators just find other videos online. So you can make a really simple video. You can find one online. I think once you do that, once you give that to your students and just see how class feels when you're not responsible for delivering knowledge from the front of the room, you're going to like it, right? You're going to have more fun. You're going to enjoy being with your students and spending that time with your students. And then you can say, okay, well, you know, let me make another video. Let me find another video. Over time, as with anything, you get much better. You get more confident, right? If you're finding videos online, you'll know more quickly what's going to work for your students and what isn't. If you're making your own videos, that first one might take you an hour to do a 10-minute video. But pretty soon you're just going to get more and more comfortable. It's like anything, it's like a skill. And it's going to save you time in the long run because you don't have to repeat yourself. So
You
I
did,
would,
yeah.
yeah, I would say to people, like, if you think about this whole model, how it comes together, it sounds like a lot. But if you think of it as really small steps, it's really not harder than planning another lesson. You know, record your explanation. After your video is finished, students should get off their screens, close the computers, do some practice work on paper, right? You probably have some work that they'll do already after your explanation. And then you just need a mastery check. That's one or two questions to see whether they've understood. None of that should be that hard to plan. Do one lesson, do two lessons, do three lessons like this. I bet you're going to enjoy teaching this way, and I bet you're going to want to teach like this more often.
That's really cool. You hit on something, and I know that you've written a book, and I want to talk about that too for a second. Before we do, I want to ask you this question because you hit on something that I keep hearing about, right? Which is time management. Everything sounds good, but as a teacher, I feel like I have less and less time in the classroom for any number of reasons. There's paperwork that has to be done. Again, there are classroom disruptions that are happening at a higher rate than maybe they were a couple of years ago. There are standards that we have to get through. So when I think about time, the idea of doing something new can sometimes feel like it's another thing on my plate, right? And so I think what I'm hearing you say is that, yeah, it might take you a little while at first to get going, but once you do, you can save yourself time. And I love the idea of a video as an individualized thing the kids can sit and listen to that frees the teachers up to move around the classroom and engage. I also love it potentially as a way to save time. So can you talk a little bit about the time savings and what educators can do with that time?
Absolutely. I mean, learning anything new is an investment, right? You put in time now to learn something with the hope that it will pay off in the future. And I think using this model as a teacher myself, this was the best investment that I ever made. I mean, when I started teaching, I would feel so stressed every day. Like I've got to go in, I've got to stand up at the board, I've got to deliver a lesson, control behavior. I got to give this big performance and I hope it's going to work. Then when I realized actually my role could be to create videos and give my students practice and mastery checks, it wasn't like I was responsible for this big performance every day. I just sort of showed up and helped my students learn, right? I knew who was working on what. I knew who needed what support. I walked around the room and provided it. And my students could support each other too, right? They weren't sitting quietly listening to me. They could help each other out. They could learn together. And so the class just became so sort of calm and fun, not just for me, but also for my students. And yes, that did mean that sometimes after school, I had to stay a little later to record the next day's video or the next week's video. Eventually I sort of got into a habit where I could just record like 4 videos at once, start my camera, record, and then I break that up into 4 different videos. So I got much more efficient with the planning process, and it made my life and my day so much easier. Also, I would say by my third year doing this, I was not really lesson planning anymore because everything was done. I really just showed up and helped my students learn. And sometimes I might make improvements here and there, but imagine explaining everything once now so that you never have to repeat it again. That's pretty powerful in terms of a time saver if you can make that initial investment up front.
This notion of creating sort of a portfolio that you can augment and adjust over time as opposed to starting over from scratch every year is really, really powerful. Now, you've written a book and, you've spent some time on this method. You've obviously been delivering it across the country and to educators across the world. And you've kind of sat down and you've thought about all of the things that you've learned and you've put it together into a book called Meet Every Learner's Needs. Right? Redesigning instruction so that all students can succeed. And I want to hear a little bit about the book, first your process for creating that, and then sort of the reason why you wrote the book and what you hope to, see as a result of putting these lessons out there for other folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. I mean, it was a little bit of a strange decision to write this book, given that Modern Classrooms is a nonprofit and you can learn all about our approach and model for free online. So why write a book? I think there were a couple reasons. One is that I really wanted to share the story, not just of how this approach works, but where it came from, right? What were the challenges I was facing as a teacher, and how did these practices help me address them? I think if you can understand that story, understand the challenges that motivated this approach to teaching, you'll really understand the approach in a different way. I also think, I didn't just develop this model overnight, all in one day. It developed over time because I recorded videos and then I said, well, videos are great, but how do I keep all my students on track? And then once I had them sort of on track, I said, how do I make sure that students are really achieving mastery? And what do I do with my time? And so it was really like a step-by-step process for me to develop this approach. And I wanted to show teachers that even though the whole modern classroom model may seem sort of daunting, there are simple steps that any teacher can take to implement it in their own classrooms. And the reason I know that there are simple steps to take is that I took these steps myself, right? I just wanted to share that and make it feel really accessible. The final reason that I wrote it is I think, an online course is great, but sometimes, when we're online on our computers, it's easy to get distracted or, go down one path or another. Our emails are coming in. I think to really understand this model, it helps to engage with it in a deep way. And I think if you read this book, which is not a long book, it's not a complicated book, it's simple steps, but you're going to come away with really a deep understanding of, okay, here's why it's so hard to meet every learner's needs. Here are some actionable things I can do today to do that. Here's how it worked for Rob. And here's how it's working for thousands of other teachers too. I mean, the book features tips from 45 different educators all over the world who share their own perspective on, well, here's how I make my videos great, or here's how I motivate my students. Here's how I assess mastery. So that's what the book is really meant to be, your sort of step-by-step companion to doing this in your classroom as well.
I love this idea of educators learning from other educators, and this fact that you've been down this road and you're sharing that experience. I imagine it wasn't a straight line. And so while you've gone through these steps, you've also probably learned what not to do as you go through. And have you found that, when you go through this process that you do run into roadblocks? And if so, how do you overcome those challenges? And will something like this be helpful?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's part of the reason to tell my story, because I did encounter a lot of challenges. I remember like the first day that I had videos, my students all watched the video and they said, okay, Mr. Barnett, what do we do next? And I was kind of like, I didn't have a great plan for that. Usually I spent all class sort of up at my board, like explaining things. The video was so quick that there was more time. I didn't know what to do with it, or, Like I had students, they were self-pacing, but they were all over the place, right? Some were like weeks ahead of others. And I had to think, okay, how do I keep my students together? How do I prioritize the content? All those things. So absolutely, there are challenges, and I try to talk in an honest way about how I overcame those challenges. I think one big challenge a lot of teachers have is that they like the approach, they think it's going to work, but they wonder, how will my students react? How will my administrators react? How will parents react? You know, am I going to be in trouble for teaching this way? And so one thing I really dive into in the book is, how do you respond to that pushback? And how do you show students, administrators, family that this approach is not just better for you as a teacher, it's better for all of them too. I wanted to give teachers confidence to deal with maybe some of that pushback and some of those hurdles.
Really cool. This idea that you've kind of, you think, developed a better mousetrap here, right? You've gone through a process, and as a result, you've created something that's slightly different. When you implement this process the way that you've described it, can you kind of share with me the feeling that you get in the classroom, or the feeling that you get with parents? Because sometimes I think we talk about the things that happen, but there's this other thing that goes on, which is essentially the attitude in the school and the classroom when people are learning and they're engaged. And I'd love to get a sense for the feeling or the change in feeling that you observed when you went through this process.
Sure. I mean, when I think about why I became a teacher, it's because I wanted to develop relationships with young people and help them grow. It's not because I wanted to stand at the front of the room and exercise power over them and have them be quiet and listen to me. But that's how it felt often as a teacher. Like I had to stand up at my board and control the classroom. I didn't like that. It was frustrating, and I didn't feel like I was achieving what I wanted to achieve. I think when I changed that and I was able to sit down with my students during class, it was fun. It's the best word I can use to describe it. Like I was getting to know the young people. I was watching them not know how to do something, watch a video, ask me questions, work with their classmates, and then learn how to do it. And I knew they were really learning it because I was giving them these mastery checks. And whether it was the first time, the second time, the third time, they were really showing mastery. And that's just, that's satisfying, but it's also enjoyable. It's what I wanted out of teaching, was those relationships and that pride in watching students really learn. When it comes to how it felt with families or administrators, oftentimes they would come in a little bit skeptical. Like, why are you not teaching? Why aren't you standing at the board? Why are you using computers? Computers aren't good for education. And then I would sort of sit down with them and show them, like, look, the reason I've put my videos online is so that I can sit down with your student in class and get to know them. And here's what I know about your kid. And here's what I can see about their progress. And by the way, here's what's available to your kid at home. You can watch the videos with your kid, right? It's all there. And the parent says, wow, like, this is really powerful. You know my student, and I can help my student at home. Administrators, the same thing. They think, they want to see classrooms that are lively with relationships and collaboration and discussion. And that's not how it works when you're up at the board, making everyone sit and listen. But when you step down from the board and you create structures for students to control their own learning, all those things that administrators want to see actually happen. They start to see discussion. They see students deeply engaged. They see that you as the teacher have a lot of data on students. And so I think once they understand the model, they almost every parent or administrator I could think of appreciated how it was helping the young people learn.
So the book is called Meet Every Learner's Needs. This is Robert Barnett with the Modern Classrooms Project. Robert, I just want to thank you again for spending a little bit of time with us here. I have one last question, for you, which is, if I'm listening to this and I'm a teacher and I'm thinking, again, I love this idea, where would you recommend that I start, right? Should I read the book first? What should I do to get going? And how can I participate in the community so that I can continue to learn?
It's hard because there are a lot of different things that you could do, but reading the book would be great if you like a book that will walk you through things step by step. Of course, I recommend the book. If you want to do something that's a little bit lower commitment to start, just to dip your toe in this, I'd recommend you just go to learn.modernclassrooms.org. That's our free online course from the Modern Classrooms Project. Start there and spend 10 or 15 minutes just learning about the approach and seeing how teachers have implemented it. We have all different examples from real teachers who do this. Just get a sense of the approach, see if you think it's something that interests you. And then from there, you